So you guys are all teens here, right? I want you to imagine for a second. Um, every teen kind of goes through this. Most teens do go through this time where they get their permit, right? In order to be able to get their driver's license. And I want you to imagine for a second that every mile that a teenager drives, or every hour that a teenager drives, gets you closer to your driver's license. And you can imagine, that this teen is dreaming of the time where they eventually get that freedom to be able to drive themselves wherever they want to go, and don't have any restrictions on their license, so they can take anybody with them, right? It's this sense of freedom that you'll get when you finally earn your license. Now, the desire for independence is the main driving force behind what they do. And today we're going to be talking about, or we're going to be discussing a driving force that should be behind all that we do as Christians. Now, we're going to be continuing our series from Lessons from the Lamb. And particularly, we've been talking about the Beatitudes. And so we talked about blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And we talked about this spiritual cup that we want to continually empty out and allow for God to pour into, so that we can pour onto others, right? And just having this awe and desire to follow God. Then we talked about blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And we had this idea of somebody who gives up their past life, or gives up something in order to follow Jesus, and being comforted for that, and knowing that it is going to be okay. And then we heard, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And we talked about this obedience and humility towards God, and doing what He wants us to do, so that we can show to others what that looks like. And now we're going to hear, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Now, I'd like to refresh. When we talk about what it means to be blessed, Jesus is saying here, listen, I understand that following these things that I'm going to lay out to you is going to be difficult. In fact, I know that laying out these things is going to require you to turn away from your human desires and turn to my desires. And so there is going to be a reward in the end for these obedience. And this blessing is what brings us into a closer relationship with God, versus being cursed, which puts us away from God. And so we're brought to this idea, like, what does it mean to hunger and thirst for righteousness? This is a concept that is a little bit more difficult for us to understand. We don't hunger in the same way that people in the first century did. We don't hunger, we don't thirst. You see, even those who are hungry today have a lot of resources to their disposal that are going to help them to get the food that they need. We have different ministries and resources, and food banks, and WIC, and food pantries, and all of this stuff, where people can get the essentials that they need to survive. But in Jesus' time, many people lived on the brink of starvation. The food shortages were common amongst both urban and rural communities. Okay, so even if you were out on the farm, we when we think about farming now versus farming then, we didn't have all these tools or supplies or things that made it so that we couldn't get weeds in there, or pests. I mean, these are common problems, and you could probably expect that a lot of your crop was just going to be lost to all of these unexpected things. And poor people, in fact, were even worse. They were barely making it by, and people in that time were nearly paid daily to make sure that they had the opportunity to feed their families. In fact, if no one in that household went to work that day, there was the likelihood that that family was going to go hungry. and you didn't have a job in the same way that we have a job nowadays. Okay, you would go down to the market. In fact, Jesus talks about this in Matthew 23. It says, "In going out in the third hour, he saw people standing idle in the marketplace." You would go down to the marketplace, you would wait for work until somebody said, "Hey, you look like a great guy who could help me out here." And sometimes you would wait there all day and never be hired. And so it wasn't the same thing where you get up at 9 a.m., you go to work, you come home, and you know what your job is going to be every single day. These were a lot of laborers. More than that, access to clean drinking water was often scarce. It was something that only the rich people could access, and Roman aqueducts were still relatively new. And so, can you imagine what it would be like without the modern, well, I want to say luxury, right, of clean drinking water? We like to think of this as a standard in our lives, but this is really kind of a luxury. It would have been terrible, gross if you couldn't, if you get water, you would have to go down to wherever clean water was available and get it, bring it back. We didn't have, a shower that you could immediately just, turn on. And so it's no surprise that people would have been thirsty and people would have been hungry. And so this metaphor that Jesus brings to them, right, about being hungry and thirsty would have resonated with his crowd. It would have been a painful nature that they would have understood of being both food and water deprived. And it's also interesting when we think about how God uses food in ministry. In fact, in Matthew 4:4, uh, Jesus is wrestling with Satan and temptation, and Satan says, "Listen, just turn those stones out there into bread. You can do it. You're Jesus." And Jesus replies, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but every word that comes from the mouth of God." Isn't it amazing? When we think about what it means to be a follower of Christ, that we are going to be satisfied with more than just food. You see, thirst and hunger in Jesus' ministry take on a even deeper meaning. It means having a deep craving for righteousness that can only be fulfilled by righteousness. Right? When you have a hunger for food, you put food. When you're thirsty, you get something to drink. So this hunger, this craving for righteousness is only going to be fulfilled by righteousness. And so righteousness, as we can understand it, is this desire to live a right lifestyle. This is the lifestyle that Jesus called us to live. Now, where do we get our understanding of righteousness? No, if you don't know this by now, you can find all of the things that you need to know in your Bible. In an amoralistic culture, it's hard for us to be able to find righteousness on our own, right? Everybody defines what's good and bad in their own eyes, and unfortunately, that can lead many people to believe something that is not true. And so we must look to the Bible to find our understanding of what it means to live a right lifestyle. Now, when we have this desire, right, we also are going to have this desire for justice, to see things return to order. We have this desire when right and wrong are crossed and somebody does the wrong thing, that they will be reconciled with the person that they've done something wrong to. And isn't it crazy that you and I have wronged the Lord, when we do things, when we sin against Him. But God is going to be gracious in His judgment. And Jesus took on the judgment for us so that we might be saved. Now, this is difficult in a world where a lot of other things are our thirst and our hunger, right? We chase temporary things of this world. Maybe we try to find our fulfillment in like relationships. So many people try to find their fulfillment in a relationship. And I can tell you this, if you look for another person to complete you, you're going to be left dissatisfied. Because that person on the other side is also a sinner. Or maybe we look for things, items. Um, Maybe we look for, collecting all of this stuff, money, right? Thinking that we're going to find some fulfillment in having all of this amazing stuff. Well, I can tell you this, all of that stuff means nothing. All of that stuff is just it. It's just stuff. Or maybe we're trying to find our fulfillment in how others feel about us, our appearance, right? Our social media appearance. Our lifestyle is convinced that everyone wants to know what everyone else is doing at every point in time. They think that everybody cares about what you're doing, right? And you need to post it online. And I can tell you that if you try to find your fulfillment in other people, right? If you try to, look great on the outside, that's going to leave you feeling even more hollow on the inside. You see, like I said, with the relationships, when we place our fulfillment in other people, we lose. And so, what does it mean when we actually do, hunger and thirst for righteousness, and we do want what God is going to bring to us, and then we're going to be satisfied? Well, satisfied means that you're going to be filled with as much as you need to fill your hunger. You're going to stop desiring for other things, right? Things that are against God. And God is going to bring about a satisfaction in your life that is going to bring you completely full to where you don't need to eat anymore. God is all that you need. He's going to give you all that you need. And so when we desire for the things of God, we can know that as Christians seeking righteousness, that God will be at work all around us.